Right, today's talk is about weak vowels. And the basic claim is that in English we have really two sets of vowels. The strong vowels, which you're already familiar with, and a separate set of weak vowels that are used in unstressed syllables, in certain unstressed syllables. Now we've already come across this, I'm sure you have, in the notation involving the symbol, the ordinary letter I, that we use in transcribing words like happy, coffee, valley, where it's at the end, glorious, where it's before another vowel, and in the weak form of a word such as me, which we see in tell me. Now, the point here is twofold. First of all, there's the linguistic, the phonemic point, that in stressed syllables, strong syllables, we do need to make the difference between E and I, because green and grin mean different things. Sleep and slip. Don't sleep on the floor is different from don't slip on the floor. Feeling and filling are different. So that's in those stressed syllables. But in these unstressed syllables, this distinction does not apply. There's no possibility of distinguishing a word happy from a word happy. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. Which brings us to the other point, namely that there is considerable variation in the usage of native speakers. Some people say happy with a definitely id-like quality, like grin. Other people say happy with an e-like quality, such as green. Many people use something that is intermediate between them, or fluctuate inconsistently. Now, I know for many of you it's difficult in the first place to distinguish the vowels of green and grin, sheep and ship. So really for you this is good news, because it means that in these weak syllables it doesn't matter. You don't need to listen for the difference, you don't need to worry about it when you pronounce it, as long as it's in approximately the right area. Linguistically we speak of the neutralization of this distinction. This is a technical term which is actually a translation of the German word Aufhebung, introduced by Trubetskoy in the 1930s, who first analyzed this kind of phenomenon. Well, we similarly have a weak U vowel, which we see in words such as value, thank you. In thank you very clearly, because we say you for the strong form of you, but we don't say thank you with the same strong U, we say thank you. Thank you, and that's the corresponding U. Situation, influence before a vowel, weak form of to before a vowel, to ask. In Daniel Jones you find these equated with the vowels grin and slip, and indeed in Gibson as well. Which is fair enough if we have one system that applies in all syllables. But A, this excludes the millions of people who use a rather tenser vowel in that position, and B, it doesn't reflect this phonological fact of neutralization. There is a problem, 1.3 on the handout, when we have inflectional endings added to the end of words ending like this. So if baby has this coffee vowel, happy vowel, what do we have in babies? Now there are people who say something like baby with a tense E, but babies with a laxer quality. There are others who don't make any difference, either having in both, babies, baby, babies, or E in both, baby, babies. Same with the past tense of carry, carried, and in words like prettier and value. Well, the way to test this out, I must do a picture of this, I haven't done it yet, is to ask people about cabs, taxis, and the plural of tax. We have to pay our taxes. Do they sound the same, or do they sound different? they all got into taxes. You've got to pay your taxes. Well, for me, they sound the same, but I'm not necessarily typical. There are many, many other speakers of English who have a subtle difference between them. Taxes, that sort of thing, and that justifies using the different notation, that is, keeping the notation of the happy vowel in words like taxi, even in plural. Well, anyhow, all of this then reflects the general point that we have a system of weak vowels which is different from the strong vowels. And these weak vowels essentially arise from the process of weakening. English, like Russian, has a system of weakening its vowels in unstressed syllables. Unlike Russian, though, this is inconsistent. In Russian, you weaken vowels according to very clear rules in unstressed syllables. In English, in some unstressed syllables we weaken, but in others we don't. And that's the difficulty in English. Well, we can see this in related words like preside, president. As you know, what a president does is to preside. And if we compare the first vowel in president, where it's stressed, you can see it's pre. But when it's unstressed, it's weakened, preside. Some people weaken it to schwa and say preside. The point is it weakens. Nobody says preside, but we all say president. The second vowel in preside is in strong I form, but in president it's weakened to E. You might also compare presidential, the adjective, where the stress is thrown onto the final syllable, therefore the vowel has to strengthen, and we get E rather than presidential. So we really do have to recognize processes of weakening in English. Here are more examples. Fairy, air in the first syllable, but variety, v in the first syllable. Fairy, there's our weak happy vowel in the second syllable, also in variation where it's followed by a vowel, but in variety, where the stress is thrown on it by the -ty suffix, you get I, variety. Now, the precise nature of the weak vowels varies a bit. I mean, weak vowels don't matter all that much, and you get difference among different speakers. So, if we take this word down at the bottom, which I call visibility, there's my the transcription of my pronunciation in large at the bottom, visibility. Daniel Jones, 100 years ago, pronounced it as, if I can imitate, visibility. Visibility. With I in each syllable, visibility. Well, it would sound very funny and old-fashioned nowadays to say visibility. The philosopher Bertrand Russell spoke of infinite possibilities. Infinite possibilities, which again now sounds very old-fashioned. Nowadays you say infinite possibilities. So there is a kind of drift in weak vowels from I, which is now a bit old-fashioned in some positions, towards And there are some people who would use more than I do, indeed in plurals like horses rather than horses. But the point remains that we weaken. Now we weaken not only in these lexically related words, derived words from the same stem, but also, as you well know, in weak forms. Words with weak forms have a strong form with a strong vowel and a weak form with a weak vowel. And the essence of a weak form is that it has a weak vowel. So strong form for, weak form for. What did you ask for? Strong form, strengthened position. I asked for more, for, weak form. Can, strong form, strong vowel a. Can, weak form, weak vowel I can run faster than you can. I can, weak form, I can run faster than you can. Them, strong form, them, weak form. It was them, strong form because it's stressed. I saw them do it, weak form them. So here too we've got this alternation between strong and weak, this process the weak. Well, what are these weak vowels? The vowels that result from weakening. That's how we define them. We've got three obvious ones to start with. The happy vowel, somewhere up here, front close-ish. The thank you vowel, somewhere up here, back close-ish. And the schwa in the middle. Now you see, instead of putting pinpoints on my vowel chart there, I've given you great vague ellipse shapes, because I think it's unrealistic to attempt to locate weak vowels too precisely. It doesn't matter where exactly they are. And whether you say happy or happy, doesn't matter. Whether you say visibility or visibility, doesn't matter. The go, a go. Doesn't matter. Somewhere in that area. Well, I'm afraid it does mean the English vowel system is rather complex. Here are some examples of related words where we can see long vowels, short vowels, and weak vowels for the same morpheme, the same bit of the word. So we have to compete. Stressed on the peat is therefore strong vowel E, long vowel. In the adjective form competitive, we switch to the short strong vowel. Compete, competitive, related words. But in competition, because of the effect of the ischen suffix, the same syllable is now weak, and so we pronounce it either with I or with a weak vowel, either competition or competition, doesn't matter. And this is really the essence of why English spelling is so very confusing, because it does not tell you in these related words whether we're dealing with a strong long vowel, a strong short vowel, or a weak vowel. And yet to sound even halfway natural in English, you've got to get on top of this and learn which vowel is which. Same sort of thing in conspire, long, strong I, conspiracy, short, strong I, and well, there isn't any word conspiration, but we do have inspiration, where it's weakened again to the order. Tone, tonic, intonation. O, long, off, short, weak. Historian, or long, historical, off, short. History, either schwa, history, or in fact that can be lost entirely. We can say history with just two syllables, 0. Compare, comparison, comparable. Some people say comparable or comparable, but if you say it with a stress on the com, then you get weakening comparable. Now, the question is, what vowel do we weaken to? Observe this line round the outside here. What this tells us is that I and E generally weaken to I, or sometimes schwa, whereas all the other ones weaken to schwa, of the short vowels. So, repetition tells us this is an E. It weakens to repeat or repeat. Less weakens to this or this in careless, careless. Angel, that's an but when it's strong, angelic, it has them and them. Careful, well, full, but we weaken to schwa, careful. From, us weakens to us, at to us. Anatomic, anatomic, and so on. So, these vowels weaken to schwa, and these to e. That seems fairly common sense. Long vowels behave in a similar way, really. The group that end my system B that I gave you early on go to E, the happy vowel, sometimes to schwa, depending on position. The U, O, ow go to U, thank you, sometimes to schwa, and the others all go to schwa. Well, look back at the handout now for a minute. Section 3. We've got those E, U, and but at least in my kind of English, we have to recognize probably two further weak vowels. We can see that E itself actually behaves as a weak vowel because we have it in words like finishing. Now there it's strong in the stressed syllable, E, fin, but in the other two it's where we would expect a weak vowel, finishing. And indeed, we've seen it in democracy compared with democrat and so on, weakening to I. Now, I say this is something sort of specific to received pronunciation because there are varieties of English that always treat these as schwa. Australian English is a very good example of this. In Australian English, you say finishing. Finish. It might be I in shing because it's between those rather palatable consonants. But anyhow, there's no opposition. And in Australian English, you don't really need to recognize any weak distinction between I and Now you do in my kind of English because in a word like valid, I have a different vowel from what I have in salad. Salad ends in lud, valid ends in lid. Australians typically say valid and salad with the same quality, it doesn't matter, and many Americans do this too. So, even though I might make a difference, what we have learnt from Dr. Jenkins, amongst others, is that, well, there are a lot of native speakers who don't make a difference, let alone non-native speakers, so contrast of weak vowels doesn't really matter. Even odder in RP is the U that you get in words like stimulus, rather than a schwa stimulus that other accents might use, executive, executive. Trouble is, in England, this is all associated with these matters of style and social class. Now, I say executive because that's the kind of person I am. If I were to say executive, either I'm being very colloquial or I'm pushing myself down market. You don't need to know about this. You don't need to take any notice of this at all, I think. But that's why I, for example, would say executive and virulent rather than using an in those positions. Anyhow, 3.3, we do have to note the important point that although stressed syllables must contain a strong vowel, it doesn't follow that unstressed syllables must contain a weak vowel. Many unstressed syllables have strong vowels. Obviously in compounds, bedtime, I, there, strong vowel in the weak part of the compound. Acorn, words that are not compounds, we don't call it an acorn, we call it an acorn, that's the fruit of an oak tree, of course. Still less do we call it an acorn, as some people might imagine. No, it's an acorn. Colleague, word mentioned by Dr. Jenkins, stressed on the col, but with a strong E, colleague. Chemical names like sulfate, keeps strong suffix ate. Gymnast, the noun torment, from the verb to torment, all of those have strong vowels in unstressed syllables. So we can't apply an absolutely general rule in the way you can in Russian. Well, the next topic, 4 on the handout, is the question of syllabic consonants. Why does this belong here? Well, because syllabic consonants occur only in weak syllables. They never occur in stressed syllables. And according to my analysis, syllabic consonants all consist really of a schwa, together with a liquid or a nasal. So, in a word like sudden, we have 2 syllables, sudden. But arguably, this represents the sequence sudden. Indeed, it is possible to say sudden, though you risk sounding childish or foreign if you say sudden or suddenly instead of sudden and sudden. With syllabic M, we certainly have a very free choice between blossom or blossom, whether the is there overtly or not. Is it medal or is it medal? Well, for me it's got to be the second, medal, but there are people who say medal. In a word such as gathering, where we get an R link before the following ing suffix, we have the option of turning into and saying gathering, gathering. Of course, in American English, words like father, American pronunciation corresponding to my father, I would apply the same analysis. That's a and an but they are pronounced simultaneously. Now, the point is that we retain the syllables. Sudden still has two syllables, even with syllabic M. Blossom still has two syllables. Medal still has two syllables. Gathering, so pronounced, still has three syllables. And that's why we call these syllabic consonants. So I see this as a kind of superficial phonetic phenomenon, but underneath, underlying it, as we say, we have a weak schwa vowel which coalesces phonetically with the following nasal or L. Well, that's then relevant to the next topics we have to discuss. I want to look at two further phenomena which involve weak vowels, and only weak vowels. And the first of these is the phenomenon which I call compression. In many words in English, we have a choice about the number of syllables we pronounce. A choice in the sense that the speaker can freely choose whether to say lenient as 3 syllables or lenient as 2 syllables. It really doesn't matter at all. It may depend upon stylistic factors. You can say influence, 3 syllables, influence, or you can compress it to 2 syllables, influence. You can say prisoner, 3 syllables, or you can say prisoner, 2 syllables. You can say it was rattling around, 3 syllables, rattling, or you can say rattling, rattling around, 2 syllables. You can ask, what's your preference, 3 syllables, or you can ask, what's your preference, 2 syllables. So this is a phenomenon that's found in many languages, whereby I and U lose their syllabicity before another vowel and become the corresponding semivowel. But it also applies in English to syllabic consonants, which in exactly the same position lose their syllabicity and can become non-syllabic. We've got examples of this on the handout as well. Some of the examples on the handout are the same, some are different. But 5.2, generally the uncompressed version, that's the slow version, is more usual in rarer words, in slow or deliberate speech, and the first time a word occurs in a discourse. But the compressed version, the rapid version, is more usual in frequently used words, in fast or casual speech, and if the word has already been used in the discourse. So people who don't talk about history very much would call it history. Here we have a department of history, they always call it history, because it's a word they use all the time. Both pronunciations are correct. Now, 5.3 you can see that the process of syllabic consonant formation, that's what we had in 4, and then compression, what we've got now, the two together add up to the same thing as schwa elision. So if you've got a word like preference, you start off with preference, write it down. Preference. We then have syllabic consonant formation, which makes it preference. And we then have compression that removes the syllabicity and gives preference. And all three are acceptable pronunciations of this word. Notice the consequences here. Now, one very important restriction in English is that you get compression only before a weak vowel. Only before a weak vowel. Again, this is why it's relevant to define what the weak vowels are. You may know that the suffix spelled ate is strong in verbs, but weak in adjectives. So the verb is to separate. We've got to separate these two things. But the adjective is separate, with or for some people it, which is therefore a candidate for compression, giving separate. There, we keep them separately from one another, separately, separate. We can compress there, but we couldn't say separate instead of separate. The verb to moderate must keep 3 syllables always, to moderate, but the adjective moderate can compress to moderate, moderately well. Compression only before weak vowels. Now, speakers of Spanish, this is why English behaves strangely, from the Spanish point of view, in Spanish loanwords. We have borrowed the words fiesta and siesta from Spanish. In Spanish, they're pronounced as 2 syllables each. Fiesta, siesta. In English, they're pronounced as 3 syllables. Fiesta, fiesta, siesta. Why? Because the e is a strong vowel, it has the stress, and we can't compress before a strong vowel. The Spanish city of Santiago, in Spanish, has 3 syllables. Santiago. In English, how many syllables does it have? 4. Santiago. Because we couldn't compress I to Y before strong R. Santiago. And many other examples. San Diego becomes San Diego with a syllabic E. All of this sort of hangs together in a way that brings together the topics of weak vowels, vowel weakening, syllabic consonant formation, and stressing. Look, and compression. Look here. If you say, tell me a story. First of all, me has its weak form, me. Tell me a story. Now, as long as it's followed by weak schwa, then we can compress, giving tell me a story, tell me a story, tell me a story. The train is about to arrive. To has its prevocalic weak form to ask, to eat, to arrive, which can then compress to twa. The train's about to arrive, about to arrive. But can we say, I want to ask a question? No, we can't, because there ask is a strong vowel, No compression before strong vowels. You can't say twask. You have to say to ask. I want to ask. I want to ask a question. Same thing with a syllabic consonant. And has a weak form un, from which we form by syllabic consonant formation. Out and about, syllabic n. As long as it's followed by weak we can get unsyllabic, non-syllabic, simple n, and say out and about, to get out and about, to get out and about. So what this tells us is that in many words, in fact, we have two possible pronunciations. We can either have a slow, uncompressed form, or we can have a quicker, compressed form. And again, this is really good news because it means it doesn't matter which you say, you can freely choose between them. But what I must point out is this block on compression if the following vowel is strong. And that again is why it's important to distinguish strong vowels from weak vowels. Here are some more examples. A couple, syllabic L, of minutes, of weak form, a couple weak vowel. So instead of a couple of minutes, we can perfectly well say a couple of minutes. A couple of minutes ago. A couple of minutes ago. Last example is really quite complex. Neighbour, a neighbour. When it's followed by a vowel, of course it's subject to linking R. So a neighbour of ours becomes a neighbour of ours, one of our neighbours, a neighbour of ours. We've now got a followed by schwa plus R. That's a candidate for syllabic consonant formation, like gathering becoming gathering. So a neighbour of ours becomes a neighbour of ours. A neighbour of ours. It's this one here. And because the syllabic consonant is now followed by a weak vowel in of, it can lose its syllabicity, giving a neighbour of ours. A neighbour of ours. So we've got this chain of derivation, starting from each word, as it were, pronounced on its own, through these processes of connected speech, ending up with a typical pronunciation in connected speech. Now, it's all logical, it's all bound by rules. All rule governs, the linguists say. But this does explain, again, why people who've learnt English, particularly in its written form, are sometimes faced with difficulty in understanding spoken English, colloquial spoken English, where we typically apply these rules. And this means that in this case, well, the word neighbour has turned into a neighbour, and there are many other cases. There is also a problem in the case of compression, a problem in deciding what dictionaries should tell you or what textbooks should tell you about the pronunciation of words. Because with some very common words, over the course of history, we have more or less forgotten the uncompressed form, and we now use only the compressed form. This is very strikingly the case in a word such as every. Now, if you look at lyrics of songs, pop music and so on, you will still often see that writing to remind you that you should say it as two syllables, every. But, to be honest, we always say this word as two syllables. Nobody normally says every. We say every. So, quite rightly, most dictionaries give it just as every and just don't tell you about the possibility of every. But in many other words that, in my view, could be similarly treated, we find differences between different dictionaries. So the word that is normally several, like every, normally 2 syllables. Nevertheless, some dictionaries do give you the form several. And it's not entirely impossible, it's not entirely obsolete, but for general purposes, general purposes, I would recommend several as the normal pronunciation. These are very common words, you see, normally compressed. Different, we don't usually say different, we say different. General, you heard me just saying it. Well, these mentions here are other dictionaries that I think have got it wrong. This is the Concise Oxford Dictionary. I did do this overhead some years ago. The more recent edition might always have changed, but I think the Concise Oxford tells you this word is general, and this word is not general. This word is normally general. I'd say reference, normally compressed. I'd say factory. I'd say battery. I need a new battery in my watch. I'd say history. Though, with all of these words, one has to acknowledge that some people sometimes pronounce them with an extra syllable and say factory, battery, history. Perhaps more widespread is victory, though I think I normally say victory. Lateral, which I normally call lateral. A camera, which I normally call a camera. Federal, which I usually say as federal. And ing forms of words like bothering, which I think I usually say as bothering, not worth bothering about. There are 1 or 2 interesting cases, though, where you think all the conditions for compression are met, but nevertheless people don't compress. The name of the country, Hungary, where Hungarians live. That has a schwa of an R. We can say Hungary with a syllabic but can we say hungry? No, we can't. And I suppose the reason is avoidance of homophonic clash. That is, we don't want it to make it sound, we don't want to make it sound like hungry, wanting food. Hungary. Though it doesn't stop us in the case of Greece and Turkey, if you think it's having homophones. Well, anyhow. Now, the last process we want to look at is the process I call smoothing. And this is rather different from what we were looking at before, because this involves strong vowels. However, it does feed into compression, which is the link with the rest of this lecture. How do we pronounce the word spelled F-I-R-E? Well, if you listen to me, you probably hear me say it as fa. Fa. Don't stand by the fa. They open fa. How do we pronounce the word spelled P-O-W-E-R? Pa. We need a bit more power. This is a very powerful machine. Fa. Now, although that's the way I normally say them, there is another sense in which I know that underlyingly these are fire and power. So again, we've got this business of a difference between what we actually say on the surface and what we perhaps know about these words underneath. Because we have a process, an optional process, which enables us to change them. So we start out as fire, fire, and power. And we can go through various intermediate reductions. We can say far, far, and far, and ultimately far. And I analyze this as consisting, first of all, of a process called smoothing, and then of compression. Now, smoothing says you take a diphthong, as for example, I, and you lose the second element of the diphthong. So we have I, and we lose the I bit. So instead of fire, we say fire, fire. Instead of our, we say our. Fire becomes far. Power becomes power. In terms of a vowel chart, this means just taking the short route. If we've got I, instead of going I, we go ah. Just taking a shortcut for the tongue, not bothering to make so big an excursion. So there's a simple phonetic explanation in terms of least effort. Aya becomes ah. Our becomes ah. But the further complication is that we can then reduce the number of syllables, because now we've got 2 syllables, we can then compress them into a single syllable, giving fa as 1 syllable. Well, historically it was 1 syllable, of course, just as much as a word like pipe. This was historically fire. So it's sort of gone through a backwards and forwards process. It can now count either as 1 syllable or as 2 syllables. We don't mind. How is this relevant to the learner of English as a foreign language? Well, mainly I think from the point of view of recognition. Maybe if you're doing English as an international language, as Dr. Jenkins wants, then you can just ignore this process, because it's generally speaking not used by those who don't speak English natively. But the problem is that those of us who do speak English natively, do often do this. And you're going to have a problem of comprehension if you are not able to deconstruct it. Where is University College? In Gar Street. Well, Gar Street. Gar. You have to be able to reconstruct Gower. Gower Street. But we call it Gar Street. Which faculty are you in? The Faculty of Science. Science. You've got to be able to reconstruct science. Well, I think that's not too difficult in a word like science, but it can cause problems, particularly with proper names. There was a fancy dress party, and the group agreed together, what should we dress up as? Let's all dress up as pirates. Unfortunately, there was a Swede among them, and the Swede from Sweden misunderstood pirate, and heard parrot. And so he came in a quite different costume. Pirate, that is pirate, or pirate, compared with parrot. So, again, that's the kind of misunderstanding that could happen if you don't know about this. His name's Hard. There's Hard. If somebody's called Brown, hello Brown. Brown. I hope you can write that name down correctly. This happens, of course, in London speech as well. I'm not a Londoner, I come from the north of England, but when I first came to live in London, I had to get adjusted to London speech, and I felt I had really arrived when I asked someone his name, and he told me his name was Zhao. And I was able to write it down correctly. Zhao. That is Dale. or London A, diphthong shifts to I. Smoothing gives us down, which is what he said. So it's all logical, it's just a matter of undoing these things, but you have to know about it in order to undo it. Last little question is to ask, does English have triphthongs? Some books say yes, Peter Roach says yes. I don't believe it. I don't believe we do have triphthongs, because in my view, if you have everything present in a word like fire, then really you have to say just two syllables, fire. If you want to make it one syllable, which we can, then you have to smooth it, far, because it's too much to get fire all into one syllable. So it's, a thing we can argue about and debate, but it seems to me that we don't need to recognize any set of triphthongs in English. All we have is sequences of diphthong plus something else, which potentially can be smoothed out phonetically and compressed into something similar.